This is the Resilient Disciples podcast. I'm Ross. You know who you are. Thank you for listening. Thank you for being here. Thank you for watching. I am so glad you're here. Today, we are continuing a conversation that is all about children's ministry in a new reality, which is both a research project and a labor of love between the Barna Group and Awana. I am joined by the president of the Barna Group, David Kinnaman, as well as the president and CEO of Awana, Matt Markins. Gentlemen, welcome back, both of you, to the podcast. Thanks for being here.
Great to be here. Thanks for having me.
Most of the people who are listening and watching are definitely familiar, David, with your work. Not only are you the president of Barna Group, but I want to set just a bit of expectation so people fully understand the scope, because especially for people like me, if they hear leading research firm, they may go, okay, I'm out, right? I got one of those degrees that was a piece of paper that said, hey, good job through college. But if my wife really is really excited about school and I never want to go back, right? So you have conducted what is probably you've directed interviews with more than 2 million individuals. You've overseen thousands of US global research studies. On a really big picture level, one of the things that I'm curious about with children's ministry and into reality, which is available now via the show notes, wherever you're listening and watching, what sets it apart? What is the thing that drew you to this project? What is the thing that makes you go like, man, this is important to you personally or professionally? What makes this stand out to you?
Well, again, thanks for having me. And Matt, it's been a pleasure to work with your team. And I'm really proud of the work that we've created in this new study, Children's Ministry in a New Reality. You've been showing the copy of that here for those that are watching. It's a beautiful book report that kind of goes through a lot of our findings. And I think what really sets it apart is so much of our work has been focused through almost 40 years of work here at Barna on adults. Sometimes we'll reach down to teenagers, but in this case, we were interviewing, children and their parents and children's ministry leaders. And it's been almost 2 decades since our company has looked at that age group. When George Barna did this incredible book called Transforming Children into Spiritual Champions. And so much has changed, clearly in ministry to younger generations and to children and the influence of screens. And so I believe this new report gives us a map to, effective ministry in this new digital reality. And, the answers aren't easy. There's no secret formula. But we do have, some indications now of some of the pressure points and some of the issues and challenges facing families, young people, and the ministry leaders who serve them.
Absolutely. Matt, I want to ask, there are folks who are listening who are probably surprised, even though they may have heard about this project or may have even heard you speak about the project directly, that Awana is even engaged in a project like this. We're so lucky and privileged to have David Kinnaman as part of the faculty of the Child Discipleship Forum for 2022. But why are we doing this? Why are we making this partnership with Barna? Why are we having David speak at the forum? What is the fruit that we see as an investment for this, for our organization as a whole?
I think people want to do a good job at what they do. So whether you're a children's ministry leader or kids pastor or a student pastor or a volunteer in a ministry like Awana or your Sunday children's ministry, you're doing it because you want to do a good job. You want to reach kids with the gospel. You want to maybe teach them in Sunday school or in small group or in your ministry, and you want to see them grow in Jesus. And we do this research because it's going to bring insight. It's going to bring those that's really helpful information, right? Like that information that's going to become insight, that's going to transfer into wisdom, that's going to convert into some level of changing what we do so we can do it better, right? All of us got into this because maybe we saw the value in youth ministry or children's ministry, or maybe we were involved on a volunteer basis and we just caught the bug. Like we saw something very powerful happen that God did in the life of a child. And we said, I want to do more of this. And so we're doing this type of work because we want to help you. We want to help you become as most effective and fruitful as possible. So I'm going to circle back to that key word that I hear and read from the Barna Group quite a bit, which is the word insight. If we can bring the best insight to the church, to leaders, volunteers, and parents, we can help you be as fruitful and faithful and as effective as possible at discipling your children and the students within your reach.
That word insight's sort of where I want to go next, because David, I became someone who's following your ministry on a regular basis through the Church Pulse Weekly podcast. But a lot of people who are listening probably became familiar with your work through your book that came out in 2018, Faith for Exiles. And one of the things that stands out to me as what's unique about that is, and I would love to hear, for folks who maybe haven't heard of this, for you to be able to describe that for them. You have this book that comes out as sort of this wayfinder, right? This sort of mile marker in the sand of Faith for Exiles that comes out. And then you have this study that comes out not too long after. But of course, there's that big event that happens in the middle of that COVID-19 pandemic. I'm curious, how you define the key takeaway from Faith for Exiles, how you define the key takeaways from this, and what has changed, what stayed the same through those two key deep projects and huge labors that your team worked on.
Thanks. Well, I feel, thanks for mentioning all that. I feel like my parents probably became aware of my ministry when I did this book called Unchristian a few years ago. They were wondering what the heck I was doing until I actually published something. No,
sure.
Just kidding. No, I've had the privilege of working on a number of different projects, and it's been more than 15 years of trying to study and understand the journeys of emerging generations of, for sociologists, it's millennials and Gen Z. Researchers just make up the idea of a generation. And actually it came from marketing because people needed the specificity of spending money on a targeted basis to boomers. And so it actually all started in the wake of World War II. The idea of generational theory. Of course, the idea of generations has been around forever, but the way we use it in the marketplace and in the church now is relatively new. And I think the key takeaways for me over this last number of years is that people don't change, God's nature doesn't change, but what does change is the context in which we work out our faith. And so there are different seasons in Scripture. Even Ecclesiastes said there's a time to plant, and a time to harvest, a time to build up, and a time to tear down. So I'm a big believer that we have to understand what God is doing in our times. First Chronicles 12:32, it says the tribe of Issachar understood the times and knew what to do. So just like Matt said, we're here partnering up with Awana to try to help ministry leaders, senior pastors too, right? It's not just the job for children's ministry professionals, but we actually need a more concerted effort, a more intentional effort. I was telling a friend of mine last week, it's like in years past, if you pretty much brought your kids to church and as a family embodied many of these values and this actually believed this stuff and really lived out a reality of God working in the world, there was a pretty good chance that young people would sort of follow in the way. And again, there's a big discussion we could have about the 1960s and the boomers and, kind of all hell breaking loose as people describe it. But the truth is that in the 1960s, most of what we would have experienced, what the boomer generation would have experienced, was really kind of a breaking loose, a fringe set of ideas. Media itself and sort of electronic media and movies and radio and television was I talk a lot about the screen age of sort of I call it digital Babylon. But if you looked at the last 150 years of the electronic age and mass communications, from the telegraph to radio to television to color television to the news media, again, newspapers have been around for a long time, but the explosion of information and then the personalization now of content. And we're doing ministry in the age of algorithms that find their way through the cracks of all the things that we imagine are the sort of the defensive walls around our children. And so, Google has become their sex educator and their best friend and their counselor and their entertainment pal. And so the efforts of trying to help young people, cling to the plausibility of faith, it is a much more difficult set of challenges than we have ever faced. And that then gets to some of the key takeaways from these two projects, Faith for Exiles, which was really about these 5 practices that seem to determine what a resilient disciple looks like, and how we can best raise resilient disciples. And then the work with Awana was really about the power of relationships and intentional relationships to help form young people that sort of stay with faith and that their faith lasts. And again, there's no magic formulas. There's no shortcuts to it. Even and especially now, it is more challenging than ever. And it's again, just hearing stories that are sort of heartbreaking in our research, even from a large study we did about 5 years ago called the Porn Phenomenon, about how pornography is reaching into younger and younger eyeballs, young men, young women, and the demonic influence of pornography in our culture today, and how it's always been part of, like, human history is replete with stories of pornography, but for the first time in human history, it is available. One of the young people we interviewed in one of our focus groups years ago said that, he was exposed to pornography quite unintentionally. Of course, we can have filters, we can have defense mechanisms, and we can, monitor our kids' screen use, and all those things are good and worthy efforts, but nothing stands in the place of having a young person actually understand and own and believe that this is a better way to live under the authority and rule and reign of a living God who cares about us at such a soul level and a personal level. So anyway, I think it's an exciting period of time for ministry today, and I get pretty excited about the opportunities that are going to come out of these last 2 years. All this was brewing, and then COVID hit, and there were a lot of really positive things that come out of these last 2 years of disruption, but it exacerbated, it put these things on full display about the need for the church to have a better, not just for kids ministry, but for all of ministry, a better mindset of discipling, because tens of millions of people just sort of disappeared.
Right.
And it wasn't because they just didn't like your online services. They just weren't that into the church in the first place. We need to be a disciple-making church, and we need to be disciple-making children's ministry first and foremost. And I think this research, again, doesn't have all the answers, but at least provides some pathway forward.
And Matt, I want to go to you next, because Awana had a similar process where we came out with Resilient in 2019, but also are part of this book now coming out in 2022. And I'm curious for you, David's talking about how important it is for this to be a whole church-wide effort. And if I'm a children's ministry leader listening to this, and we haven't really even gone into the particulars of the study, and again, I would encourage you to pick up your copy. You can check out the show notes where you can pick up it directly. If you're driving, that's why it's there, because I don't want to have to read you a very long URL. But Matt, if you are a children's ministry who's listening to this, how am I to approach my senior leadership team, or even my local, those on my KidMin team directly about this data? Because I think there's a temptation to want to storm the hill. And I think there's a better, more fruitful way to approach it.
Yeah, I love the title. I think we worked really well with the Barna group in choosing a title that really paints a picture of what this data and the insights really about children's ministry in a new reality. So I would want to talk to my senior leader about the difference between teaching the Bible and a catechismic approach. Teaching the Bible is super important, right? But a catechism creates a context. You're asking questions within the context of your culture. You're almost making a comparison. Here's what the world says. Here's what God's word says. Let me give a quick example. We just got back from vacation. We went to South Florida. We snuck down to the Keys one day to go snorkeling. I hadn't been to snorkeling in the Florida Keys since the 1990s. You've heard about this thing, coral bleaching. I'm not as much of an environmentalist as I probably should be, but I went snorkeling last week and was comparing it to my memory and the photos I have, underwater photos of the 1990s. There's a stark difference in the corals from 25 years ago, 30 years ago. And it's this whole concept of coral bleaching. Our ocean waters are documented. They're warmer than what they were 30 years ago, 50 years ago, and it's bleaching the coral. The environment of our water has changed. That's just factual. And maybe throughout history, it goes up and goes down, but in this process of going up, it is bleaching the coral. So what's the point? we teach the Bible, but if we don't teach the Bible in the context of the environment that we're living in, we're not acknowledging that the temperature of the water has risen. A catechismic approach asks a question, it engages dialogue, and it answers the question in context of the environment. It kind of sets the narrative right in the context of where we're at. And so I think this research is super important because it's children's ministry in the new reality. The water temperatures have changed, and that's changing the environment around us. So we need information for today. We need information that gives us insight for where things are going. So I think I would help my senior leader, not that they need help, but I would find ways to engage the dialogue and conversation and make sure we're on the same page for, hey, where are we today? What has changed over the last 30 years or even the last 7 years? And what do we project the near future to be? And how should we be preparing today's children, today's 10-year-old to thrive in their faith in the year 2050, which is going to be here before we know it?
Yeah, well said. David, I'm curious because you do this every day, the ways in which people have accepted that data is destiny, and the sense that you said earlier that this is an exciting time to do ministry. And I think there's a way to read some of the data that's even in the context of this report and be overwhelmed. And yet you're talking about this as an opportunity. I'm curious what are the ways where folks have taken data like this or from other studies and made really fruitful changes in their ministry?
Well, like Matt described a minute ago, I think this data actually gives the stark case for a different mindset, a different level of resourcing, a different level of intentionality around children's ministry. I grew up under the wonderful leadership of my dad, who was a pastor of a large church in Phoenix, and I can remember kind of conversations with his peers around, children's ministry and youth ministry, sort of like being adjuncts of like getting parents to come to Sunday morning worship, and sort of like, they were kind of utilities. They were meaningful, and they were, like there was never a sense that this was sort of second-rate ministry, but there was a real sense like this is just a strategy to get the adults to come.
Sure.
And so I think part of the benefit of these last 2 years is that, there's not a pastor that I've talked to or that we've interviewed that would say, hey, everything was working just fine before, during, or, such as it is after the pandemic. I think this brings a real opportunity for us to say, pastors, leaders, boards, elders, congregations, people of God, let's look at the fact that the nature of our disciple-making efforts, to our way of looking at it, our numbers is that only 10% of people that grow up with any kind of Christian experience become resilient disciples. And it's a pretty low bar I'm happy with our definition of a resilient disciple is sort of four pieces, believe in the death and resurrection of Jesus and its personal saving power for them, authority of Scripture, are active and engaged in a local church or congregation, and they believe that their faith should be active in the world some way. Those are 18 to 29-year-olds that we define as resilient disciples. Only 10%. So something is really broken fundamentally in our disciple-making efforts, and anyone with half a half a brain, with half a sort of eyeball to look at the facts would say this isn't actually working. And so we have a real case to make that how we structured this is not producing the kind of fruit and fruitfulness that we want. And so that's why I think it's exciting. I think there's a desperation. More pastors than ever are saying they're willing to look at new ministry models. And again, what's old is new. There's nothing really new under the sun. But I do think we have to recommit ourselves to a certain set of ideas about what it means to have Christian education at the heart of what we do. People don't just change from hearing a good sermon or from hearing good content. They change by being in relationship with other Christians who really believe this, who really live this out. There was an old documentary, or a relatively new documentary, about Mr. Rogers, who said, so we're loved into loving, and we're shaped into the kinds of Christians that we are by being in and around other Christians whose lives of generosity and sacrifice and really believing in the reality of Jesus in their lives rubs off on us. It shapes our limbic system, our spiritual limbic system.
Mm-hmm.
And so, we've got all this evidence of the gospel really working in the lives of these resilient disciples, and we now have, almost a pattern to follow. The catechism that Matt is talking about. We really need, Christian leaders across the board who are devoted to a new way of thinking about the catechism for our times. And if we look square in the face at the facts, we have not done what God has called us to do. We haven't. It's not for lack of trying. But Jesus says that it would be better for a millstone to be put around our necks, to raise the stakes a bit, than to mislead, some of these. And what if that's actually structural, not just not necessarily we teach heresy, but what if there's some structural reasons why we haven't actually lived up to what God is asking us to do? And I'll just give one more context for those kid ministry leaders who want to kind of take the case to leaders. If you look at our world today, there is no doubt that these three institutions that God has formed has instituted to form human beings, the family, the household, the church, the people of God, and schools, education. Those are three institutions that are primarily about the shaping and formation of human beings. And when do we find that is most effective is when people are young. You can always do work later in life. That God never gives up on anybody, and neither should we as the church. But those are the institutions that God has put on earth to sort of form us as who we are, forms our character, forms our spiritual imagination, forms who we are, all the things. Businesses, political leaders, they have a formative effect, but they're not primarily about formation of people. I think you could make a really strong argument that those three institutions today are actually at the weakest point that we have seen them in our sort of collective history in the West. Public education is under duress, all sorts of ideas about human flourishing and what it does or doesn't mean, gender ideology, lots of things there, sexuality, all the craziness of our world. And then families and households are under duress, and so are churches. And again, screens, algorithms are a wonderful part of our lives, but they also kind of get through the cracks. So we have a responsibility now to reimagine what it means to be at the center of the church and of education, our educational muscles, and households, to help to strengthen and sturdy up young people in ways that we have only imagined could be possible, but certainly is possible. And we see the data now that really paints a picture of that road forward. So anyway, it's an exciting time. And I think going to pastors and leaders and saying, look at what we could do, look what could be, and look at the pressures that we're all under. You're not crazy to imagine that the church is struggling. It is, but what could the church be in this new era, and how exciting a vision can we paint for all of us together towards that end?
Well said. One of the most encouraging pieces of data, part of the statistics that we see in this study, at least according to me, is what we would articulate around here as the power of a loving, caring adult. And Matt, I would love for you to speak on this first, but this is something that we have felt for a long time, and we've already seen some data to support, but this data now provides even clearer cut evidence on how powerful an influence one loving, caring adult can make in the influence of the spiritual discipleship of the child. How have we seen that play out within the context of Awana? But more importantly, what does that mean for the broader future of the faith, and some of what David was just speaking to?
So this insight you're referring to is that for children who have access to at least one loving, caring adult at their church community, in addition to a parent at home, those children are flourishing in their faith far more than others. So if we look at that as a chief insight, like, how do I get to that? It's like something that we want to attain and to engage in. We all have things like that in our lives that are so valuable, but we just can't seem to get to them. And so I'm going to piggyback off of some words David said a minute ago: formation, system, structure. So we want to form children in the image of a resilient disciple or a thriving disciple. but it's our systems and our structures, I think, that are preventing us from getting to these really good things that we want to. So, we hear a lot over the last 3 or 4 years about this whole idea of deconstructing faith. I think as Christ followers, we've got to deconstruct the systems around us. So let's talk about some of those things, like digital, like screens. David talked about screen or being a screenager. There's other systems of pace of life, sports and extracurricular activities. We could list a lot of things that we need to think about. What if we deconstructed or thought about how are all of these systems, maybe you could say aggressive secularism, hyper-individualization, and some other things, like how are all of these systems that our children are swimming in, how are all of those forming us? So if we would maybe think more deeply, again, about that water temperature rising, it's bleaching the coral, that environment is changing and it's forming our children in ways that are pretty significant. But there's this thing off in the distance that if we could just get to that, right? That's that one loving, caring adult that could make all the difference. I think if we would spend more time thinking about how that environment is changing, kind of deconstructing some of these other systems, it would give us that kind of insight that we need to say, oh boy, like if we don't figure out how to make that relational element one of the most important things, these other systems are going to so form our children, they're not going to become the young people who are going to become the leading adults in the future, where they're going to be thriving in their faith, they're going to be leading our institutions. So all of that to say, I think we've really got to go through that kind of a process as the church to put at the center becoming relational church communities. I think that's a process I would walk through as a church leader or a parent in my church or a key volunteer. I would be figuring out how to advance that conversation.
It's good. David, the last question I have for you is a bit more broader within the context of just what it means to be a researcher, and a data scientist, in a bunch of words that I'm not smart enough to have anywhere near my titles. You are someone who has made this your life's work. And one of the things that I'm curious about is when I look at that loving, caring adult statistic as an example, I immediately think about the loving, caring adults that are present in my own kid's life and how I can get more access to my kids, to more loving, caring adults, because I want more of that, because now I have the data to back that up.
Yeah.
And I'm curious for you, how you go about applying some of this data to your own personal life, only because I think it's valuable for people to hear that this is not something that just exists in a vacuum for you, that this is something that you're also figuring out how to live out each and every day.
Yeah, happy to answer that question. And first of all, it's while the idea of social researcher and data person, data science person, I suppose those are accurate in their own way, just like any of our work. There's a certain expertise that just comes with the doing, and there's a certain space in my brain that's pretty geeky, but also I grew up in a pastor's home. Always thought I'd be a pastor. I try to use the data in a kind of ministry, like what does this mean for ministry and for then the lives of the people that I care about, including my own family. And I think, first of all, power of research is the power to really listen and hear and understand someone else's experience. And so when nearly 9 out of 10 young people who have some sort of exposure to Christianity, and some of those are very light exposures, they might have only kind of been to a church a few times, or maybe there's other factors. But when 9 out of 10 don't end up in the category of resilient disciples, again, we should stop and listen. And Jesus himself says, if 1 out of 100 were to go astray, we should stop what we're doing and go and pay attention and find that lost sheep. And we're telling you in no uncertain terms that not only is there a problem, but there is a set of solutions, including developing meaningful relationships. And so for me, my kids, as I've seen some of this data on resilience, both from the Faith for Exiles project and children's, back to George's book years ago, and to this new project, my kids are now 18, 21, and 23. So I still have an important role, but a different role. But I do think, first, I wish I could go back and, make them small again and try again. I feel like I've screwed them up in some ways, but also like they're amazing young people. And we've been through some personal tragedy as a family with my late wife's passing from brain cancer, but I'm so proud of them. But knowing that even this notion of trying to put people around them who are, that wasn't always my doing, but recognizing the importance of other Christians around them, help me understand what this might look like. And some of these other things that we've learned about vocational discipleship and, understanding life under the authority of Scripture and all these, important things, but that can be very disconnected. It's like I sometimes laugh about how lucky my kids must be to have a dad who has PowerPoints that tell them exactly how they should be raised. Like apparently all the answers, but none of the answers. So it is personal for me. I do think, God's allowed us to do some really sweet things with our kids, but also, I now sort of trust them to the hands of the Lord. And I pray almost every day that God would just speak to them in a real and personal way, because in so much as we need meaningful relationships around them, we also believe in a real God who really speaks into the hearts of his people. And more than anything else, I just want, Jesus to make himself real and known to these three amazing kids. And to me, and to lead us on each day. And so, it's more than a job for me. It's a calling, and I've also had to do some good work about those times where just growing a good business and being a good leader and a good servant is as important as having the impact on the world and all the things. But we're just recognizing that being a good dad and that you're not going to get all these things right either. So it's a complicated set of things that God's asked us to do. But I love this work, and we're so glad to be able to serve into the church. And it's been an honor to work with Awana, who cares as much or more about sort of the destiny of these next generation, especially kids, as we do here at Barna.
Yeah. Well, thank you for sharing. And David, I would have asked the question of just saying, David, you're smarter than me. But that's not really that big of a compliment to you. So, Matt, I want to leave last word to you, which is just simply to say, I have made very clear that even if we haven't necessarily really dug into this book, and there will be a forthcoming conversation for people where we'll get more into the meat of this study and why I think that's valuable for folks. However, I do sincerely think that this project will benefit your ministry. And one of my favorite parts about working here is if I didn't, I wouldn't be having this conversation. But Matt, you are someone who gets to have this wider perspective on how not only does this project benefit a local ministry, but how this project can benefit the broader church. So last word to you, if someone's listening and they are looking at a new children's ministry year coming up in the fall, coming up a lot sooner than they may even think, how does maybe just one thing from this study help shift what could be the same year after year, some of the same was, into what could be the most fruitful year of discipleship ever?
Well, without getting into the details, I know Daniel in another podcast is going to really dig into that. But so I'm going to go micro and macro. On the micro, like on a local level, I'm just thinking of the word together. Like read this book together with 2 or 3 other people from your team, whether those are volunteers or a high capacity parent or another staff member. Read it together with people and then have discussion like, hey, what stood out to you? How is it relevant to our context? How can this help us shape, more fruitful discipleship ministry with children and students going forward? Like that's what I would be doing together on a local level. But let's take that same word together on more of a macro level. So what's happening nationally in the US with this project? So this work with Barna and Awana, we're now pulling in a third partner, which is GLOO, GLOO, which is a church data organization. We're building an assessment or an evaluation tool. So your church, as a part of a broader movement of thousands of churches, can take this assessment to evaluate how fruitful or effective is our children's ministry in these kind of 3 primary areas of relationships, Scripture engagement, and experiences, or we call those belong, believe, become. How fruitful or how effective is your church in those 3 areas? So thanks to the hard work of Barna, Awana, and now GLOO, that assessment is going to be available beginning in late September. So if your church already uses the GLOO platform, you'll have no trouble finding it. If your church is not familiar with Glue, we're going to figure out how to make sure you get connected.
Stay connected with us. We'll make sure you have all that you need to stay connected to the assessment.
Absolutely. But here's what I think is cool about that, Ross. So not only is each individual church going to get a dashboard that says, hey, here's kind of where we are, and we can take this again in a year or 2 years and see if we've made any progress, right? Like that's happening locally, but together nationally, we're collecting all this data to be able to bring a report back to the church, 12 months from now, 24, 36 months from now, to say, collectively as a children's ministry movement, here's where we're seeing growth or progress, or maybe more obstacles to overcome in these key areas of relationships, engaging God's word and experiences with children. I think that's pretty significant.
Well said. Gentlemen, thank you both for your time. Thank you guys for watching and listening, and we will talk to you next week.